The most heated rivalry in Egypt may well be the most heated on the continent of Africa, a rivalry that splits the country in two.
In Egypt, you're a supporter of Ahly or you're a supporter of Zamalek.
Roots of the rivalry is finally back, and we're visiting a continent that we've never covered before, in celebration of the historic CAF Champions League final between Ahly and Zamalek. The most successful African club versus the second most successful African club in football history. And for this occasion, I've enlisted the help of Ahmad Youssef, the editor of kingfoot.com and an expert when it comes to Egyptian football. His links are of course in the description. You'll be hearing from Ahmad as we quickly go through the foundational history of the two clubs, then explore the root of their rivalry, that initial divide, and various flashpoints throughout their shared history. Not their entire shared history, of course, but enough to give you an idea of what divides the two clubs. And if you want to stay up to date on everything Ahly, Zamalek, the Egyptian Premier League, or the CAF Champions League, among many other competitions worldwide, then our sponsor OneFootball has you covered. OneFootball makes it easy to get the latest breaking news from the players, clubs, and competitions you care about. Plus, the redesigned app gives you access to videos, highlights, transfer raters, live scores, and match trackers, and a custom-tailored newsfeed to your liking, and so much more. Available on iOS or Android, and you get a free download by using the link in the description. Thanks once again to OneFootball. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming, taking a quick look at the foundational history of the older of the two clubs, just slightly, Ahly SC. As you are already well aware, football isn't something that exists in its own bubble, and the circumstances of the world affect it greatly. Outside influence can bring the end of some clubs, or birth new ones. The latter is true of Ahly. And by the way, I know there's going to be a lot of history here, but the context is very important for understanding not only this rivalry, but the context of which both of these clubs were established. You'll see how it all comes together once we start talking about Zamalek and why Ahly and Zamalek were so divided later on in the video. So we'll do a lot of the historical context heavy lifting in this section. In the early 1900s, Egypt was still occupied by the British, and following various events such as the Denshawai incident, the clashes between the British and the Egyptians were happening more and more often, leading to a rise in Egyptian nationalism within the country. Omar Lotfi floated the idea of starting a club strictly for Egyptians. Lotfi's idea was revolutionary as, at the time, Egyptians taking part in sport and social clubs was unheard of, and with tensions rising between Egyptians and the British, any hint of a club being an Egyptian nationalist club would have led to them being shut down. And so, in order for them to find a workaround, they needed to have a guarantor, if you will, in order for the club to be official. Despite being a club that was made for Egyptians, a British diplomat signed on as their first president in order to not raise suspicion of a nationalist movement. That Brit was Alfred Mitchell Innes. Now, how much of a role did he really play within the running of the club?
You know, there's a lot of debate on the history of his exact role, really. I think Ahly want his role to be as small as possible because their ideology of their club is that it was an Egyptian club made for Egyptian people. But there is no denying that he was one of the people who helped set it up. Once the ideology was really ingrained in the club, I think quite quickly on, within a year or so, they replaced him with an Egyptian. And so I think it's kind of disputed on which side of the line the narrative wants to go, really.
So quite clearly, Egyptian nationalism plays a big role in Ahly's founding, and that's something that carried on as a point of pride throughout their history, with members of the club even leading some protests during the 1919 Egyptian Revolution. They were a club that was mandated for the Egyptian people, for all Egyptian people, no matter their place in society. But getting to the football now, while the club was founded in 1907 and officially opened in 1909 once the construction of their club was finished, the Ahly football team was formed in 1911 and they would go on tour around Egypt playing against other teams in the country. They didn't enter an official competition until 1918, taking part in the Sultan Hussein Cup. This cup also permitted British military teams to join, and thus, given Ahly's clear feelings towards the British, they refused to join for the first edition of the cup a year prior. But in the 1922-23 season, they won the Sultan Hussein Cup, the first trophy in the club's history, by beating a club composed entirely of Englishmen, the club was called Dragon, in the final. 1 year later, in 1924, they won the King Farouk Cup, which later went on to be known as the Egypt Cup or the Egypt FA Cup. As mentioned in the intro, Al Ahly went on to become the most decorated team in Egypt, winning more Egyptian Cups, 36, than anyone else, more Egyptian League titles, 42, than anyone else, and more CAF Champions League titles than any other team in the entire continent of Africa, with 8 titles to their name. In second place for all of those domestic and continental titles, George Marsbach was a Belgian lawyer who resided in Cairo and had many relationships with affluent people within Egypt. As the story goes, in early January of 1911, he decided to start a social club with an English archaeologist named Howard Carter, right on the Nile River, calling the club Kasr el Nil, later known as Zamalek. As we now know, Al Ahly was started because the Egyptians of Cairo didn't have anywhere to gather for leisure activities due to social clubs being open exclusively to the British. But at the time, Egypt wasn't just home to Egyptians and British. Belgians, French, and even some Italians and Lebanese called Cairo home as well. None of them eligible to join the British clubs. And so from its inception, Zamalek was open to anyone. It was established to consist of a mix of nationalities and a mix of social statuses at the time. And according to an article written by Ahmed Assem on kingfoot.com, despite starting out as a social club, which were sometimes more leisurely than competitive in their nature, Zamalek was competitive from the start. As Assem writes, if we look at Heliopolis, Gezira, Sporting, or the Italian Tennis Club, all of them never reached the unprecedented heights Zamalek reached, despite all being foreign-owned. This lies in the ideology of White Knights Zamalek itself. When Marsbach and his men gathered to form Zamalek, they wanted to create a superpower capable of being the best in Egypt. They didn't create a club solely for leisure time. In fact, Zamalek's second president, Nicolas Arfagi Bianchi, was a Frenchman who played as the club's first-choice left-winger. As time progressed, Zamalek never let this competitive edge down as they entered the aforementioned Sultan Hussein Cup from its inception, becoming the first Egyptian side to win the cup, ending the 4-year monopoly from the English military sides during the 1920-21 edition, and retaining the title a year later in the 21-22 edition. Now let's jump ahead a bit to 1944 before we get into the reasons for the rivalry, as Zamalek, then known as Al Muqtalat, had a name change. Following Zamalek's 6-0 victory over a weakened Al Ahly side in the 1944 Egypt Cup final, King Farouk I was so impressed by the side that he changed their name to Nadi Farouk Al Awal, or Farouk Club. Throughout their history, Zamalek have gone on to win the Egyptian Premier League 12 times, their first title coming in 1960. They've won the Egypt Cup 27 times and CAF Champions League 5 times, their last victory coming in 2002. However, they did win the CAF Confederation Cup, basically the equivalent to the Europa League in Europe, in 2019. Now before we get right down to it, it's important to remember, as always, that the aim of this series is to explore the initial reasons that the clubs and their fan bases hate each other. And more often than not, the reasons for the initial rivalry, the thing that split them, doesn't ring true in modern times. The rivalry is more grandfathered in, part and parcel with being a fan of either club. So of course, as I'm sure you've gathered already, the initial difference in these two clubs was in their founding ideologies. Al Ahly, the club for Egyptians, by Egyptians. Their name even translates to national club. And then Zamalek, a club started by foreigners who weren't permitted to join the British social and sporting clubs that also allowed Egyptians into their own club, a mix of ethnicities. The rivalry between them wasn't too strong at first because of this alone, but it built up in tandem with King Farouk becoming more and more involved with Zamalek. Given his association with the British, most Egyptians held plenty of disdain for the king, and his irresponsible and often misguided decisions, allegations of corrupt governance, and his apathy when it came to getting rid of foreign influence within Egypt didn't help to endear him to the Egyptian people at large. He was, of course, overthrown in 1952. But prior to that, he had taken to Zamalek quite fondly, as mentioned.
He was the face of the club. He was attending games. He was obviously also giving funds to the club. There was going to be a lot of favouritism towards Zamalek, and I think, in a sense, Zamalek were successful in the early days. And how much of it was due to that, you probably can guess why.
This is a common sentiment that we see in many rivalries. Whether there's truth to the allegations or not is sort of an afterthought. as the suspicions contribute greatly to the divide between the two sets of fans. In Spain, you had allegations of Real Madrid getting favoritism from Franco. In Portugal, ask any of the big three who Salazar gave preferential treatment to, and they'll give you a different answer. In those scenarios, it's a bit more muddy, but in Egypt, there was no mystery about it. It was blatant, given that King Farouk actually renamed Zamalek after himself in the 40s. The favoritism was clear, and you can imagine how the Al Ahly fans felt about it, especially when you factor in their pre-existing feelings towards the monarchy and the elite of Egypt.
Going on after that, after King Farouk, I think it actually flipped the other way around when obviously Gamal Abdel Nasser, the nationalist president, came into power in the 50s. Ahly were his club, and that's the tide swayed. And even so, the Egyptian FA was created by members of Al Ahly. Still to this day, the Egyptian FA headquarters are right next door to Al Ahly. So then the sway of controversial bias has now switched the other way, and people can, might say, oh, well, Ahly are closer to the governing bodies and things like that.
Following his ousting and the changing of the name to Zamalek, for a few decades the club seemed to be the only teams that you would support in Egypt. You were either on the side of Al Ahly or Zamalek. One Lebanese writer once said, quote, Al Ahly and Zamalek are the only political parties in the Arab world. Now, shifting gears a bit, perhaps a bit unfortunately, the main thing that media like to speak about is the violence that comes with the Cairo Derby. After pointing towards an incident during the 1971-72 season in which fan violence between these two clubs led to the cancellation of the league season after just 9 match days. Now, context is important here, and this wasn't just a mass outbreak of hooliganism and senseless violence for violence sake, and then the Egyptian government shutting everything down to punish football fans. Well, it was senseless violence, yes, but it didn't just come from nothing.
Egypt had just been at war for a number of years before that. The league had been suspended for 4 years. It was just restarting. In the 9th match week, there was the Cairo Derby, and obviously it hadn't been played in a very long time. People were just coming out of war. It was a very sensitive moment for the country, and tempers were obviously still very high.
Al Ahly were winning 2-1, and in the dying moments of the match, the referee awarded a penalty to Zamalek. Al Ahly and their fans called for corruption and favoritism towards Zamalek. This, despite foreign referees being brought in to officiate matches since the mid-50s. And so, what happened following this penalty?
Fans invaded the pitch through stones, and there were 30 injuries. And it was just at a time where Egypt was just trying to recover from this war. I think that, the government saw it as a way of, there was already too much going on off the pitch, and they were just trying to start football again. People should really be on their best behaviours, and this is the way that things have happened. And they had to stop, the season for all that violence.
And unfortunately, that trend of violence did continue on in the decades that followed. In an article titled "The World's Most Violent Derby, Al Ahly vs Zamalek" from The Guardian's James Montague in 2008, he recounts a conversation he had with an Egyptian taxi driver in London. "I am Al Ahly, of course," he told me, betraying his allegiance to Egypt's most successful football club. "I was flying to Egypt to watch Al Ahly take on Zamalek in the Cairo Derby, in the biggest match in Africa and one of the most violent football fixtures in the history of the game, in front of 100,000 strong, perfectly partisan crowd. The previously happy taxi driver's demeanor turned dark as he handed me my change. 'Do not go,' he intoned gravely. 'You will be killed.'" This, of course, speaks to the experience of the generations that grew up throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but the violence has thankfully died down in the past 2 decades.
I think fast forward to kind of today and now, one of the key things is that I don't think really the ideology still exists in terms of, you're a wealthy person, you're going to support Zamalek. You're from a bad neighbourhood, you're supporting Ahly. It's not the case anymore. And I think probably died out into the 60s and maybe, 70s, if anything. And that's how kind of, it's not a hatred of ideologies right now, I don't think.
It's about the football now. It's about dominance in Egypt, and given each side's successes, it's about dominance at a continental level. Now, more than ever. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and if you did, be sure to drop a like in order to tell the YouTube algorithm to recommend this video to other football fans like yourself. And hey, if you learned something new and want to find your way back to the channel much more easily, then consider subscribing with notifications on. A big thank you to Ahmad Youssef for his time and for sharing his vast knowledge on Egyptian football. Check out his links below, listed along with the sources in this video. My name is Adrian, I love ya, and enjoy this historic derby. Ciao!